introspective art sluts. It's Allison Moon, and you are listening to Artgasm. Today's episode is going to be a little different than even my kind of different episodes I've been running lately. If you've been a longtime listener, you know that most of my episodes are interviews with artists that work within the realm of art and sexuality. And I love these conversations, and I'm continuing to do them. But every other week, I've been switching off with doing a quickie. A quickie is just me talking about something, usually a news story or some sort of concept that I've been introduced to that I would want to share with you. And so I did that 2 weeks ago, and today is something even a little bit more different than that. It's a quickie, it's just me, but I wanted to talk less about the news and more about kind of what I've been going through, which is kind of understanding the creative process. And I want to talk a little bit about how the conversation around art creation has been moving and shifting as we've all been dealing with this global crisis. And I'm not going to get into the details of the actual issues around the disease. I do want to talk about just our day-to-day lives as working artists. And so this might be a little bit more of a pep talk or a sermon or just me externally processing a lot of concepts that I've been grappling with myself, but hopefully you may find it somewhat useful. So today I want to talk about the incentive to create, and that's actually a phrase that came about. I was having a conversation with a dear friend yesterday, and he's a sex educator and a media creator, and he just said that he was having a really hard time finding the incentive to create, that when he looks around, he just feels more of a despair sense than a creative sense. And I've been encountering that myself, and I know a lot of my peers have been feeling the same way, but at the same time, we're all dealing with that sense of looking around the world and feeling conflicted about our creative process. One of the things that I've been grappling with for a number of years now is the way that I've been raised to believe in labor. I was raised in the Midwest, and we have a very famous work ethic, and I was raised very much within the capitalist framework. I had this sense of your job is what gives your life meaning, ultimately. I was raised to believe that the most important thing I could do for society was work. And so in my family, because they came from poverty, for them, they were sold a bill of goods of get some education, find a job, work hard at that job, and you will win. And that story worked pretty well for my parents, and it worked well for my grandparents, and every generation has been a little bit better off than the one that came before. But I never really got taught how to examine capitalism in its more exploitative forms. And it's taken me until my mid-30s before I even started really understanding these concepts. And part of me feels shame for that, especially as the current political cycle talks about socialism far more comprehensively than ever in my lifetime, at least. I find myself feeling foolish for believing the story for so long. And in some ways, that was me just learning to grapple with my own privileges as a white person, as a person who was raised with education, all the different ways in which I have been given a leg up in life. It becomes like, all privileges, it's the air that we breathe. It's something that we don't often notice until we're told how it works. And it's taken me a long time to get to that point. But one of the things that I've been so much more aware of as I've been paying attention to how it is to be an artist in this world is how capitalism places a value on labor, and how our output is assigned a numerical value. Of course, we see the different forms of labor usually delineated between physical and intellectual labor. And physical labor is given a monetary assignment. It's given a monetary value. And that value, it looks often like the minimum wage. And then we have creative and intellectual labor, which is given a different monetary value, but it's still based on what you are capable of outputting and how much that output serves the state. And once I started actually seeing that, it made a lot of sense about all the stories that we've been told about our value as human beings in society, that the more we can create, the more use we are to the state, not to each other. The more we can generate, the better we are as people, the better job we're doing at being human. And this is something that is truly insidious because I think that it's a narrative that is so not questioned in a lot of Western society. I'm going to speak obviously as an American because I think we have a very unique version of how we understand labor. And I think that version of how we understand labor creates a insidious hierarchy of the right to exist. And this is one of the things that I really appreciate, particularly the disability rights movement, for bringing to light and continuing to bang the drum about, which is that we shouldn't have to be productive in order to be alive. But ultimately, capitalism, American capitalism, teaches us that the state is more important than its citizens. And so you see that right now in the ways that we're discussing the economy over human lives, that ultimately people want us just to get back to work. And that's considered to be a point of pride and patriotism. And that's certainly not just an American thing. We see that especially in the rhetoric around World War II, where it was very much this idea of you help the state achieve some sort of greater good if you just show up and work. And certainly this was the case after 9/11. It was show up and work, show up and spend money to prove your Americanness and to prove your value to society. And this is why I think that the disability rights movement is one of the most radical movements in America, because it actually seeks to question that very fundamental thing of what makes a life worth living, what makes a person worth tending to and caring for. And we have a language for that kind of thing. We talk about being productive members of society, and of course the inverse becomes a burden on society. And we talk about those things as though they are obvious, as though that is a foregone conclusion, that your ability to create and produce, the ability to either use your body or your brain to generate monetary value for the state, is ultimately the most important understanding of whether or not a person deserves to live. And I very much appreciate those people in my life who are disability rights activists for daring to question that very fundamental state, daring to say, do we need to work to be human? Do we need to work to deserve life? Do we need to work to deserve a comfortable life? What other value can we add to society that isn't about our output? And of course, there are so many different things, but we as Americans don't tend to honor those things like loving people and caring for people in non-monetary ways and looking out for one another and just providing joy and laughter in somebody's life. We still feel like we must commodify that in order for it to be valuable. And so I think that as this current time is asking for us to kind of do the opposite in order to survive, I think a lot of us artists particularly feel a sense of conflict, feel a sense of, well, art is work, and we have to prove that over and over again all the time. We have to constantly prove our right to exist as workers, to prove our right to exist as laborers, as to say that, hey, actually, creative work is work. And so there's a part of us that says, yes, we want to work and prove ourselves. We want to remind people that dance and sculpture and writing and poetry and acting and all these different forms of art matter, because for some reason, even though we're constantly interacting with those things all the time, almost every day, we still have a hard time as in our capitalist American society as thinking, great, well then I will show my gratitude in the ways that we know how to show gratitude, which is through money. So I think a lot of us want to prove that we are working, that we are creating, that we are making a difference in society, because we want to plead our case. Where at the same time, this current cultural moment is asking for us to maybe just slow down a little bit with that. Ultimately, this is not 9/11. This is a moment in which we are told in order to win, we have to stay still. We have to make our spheres a little smaller. We have to be a little bit quieter and slower and more introspective. We have to take more time and pay more attention to things we take for granted. And this is not something we do naturally as a society. This is not something that Americans are particularly good at. We are very accustomed to working harder through something, spending more money to prove that something matters. And when a moment says, actually, no, please, slow down, sit tight, and wait, this creates a deep existential concern I think this is where it's become so hard for so many of us to figure out what to do with ourselves right now because we're not quite sure, should we be working? Should we be sitting still? Now, to be clear, staying still is an immense privilege right now, and that any individual's inability to do so because of work obligations or survival obligations is not a fault of the person. It is the fault of the state. The fact that staying still and being distant from one another is the safest thing for the whole of humanity right now, the fact that very few of us are able to do that safely without fear of tremendous loss of material safety, that's the failure of the state, not that individual's character. And I think as artists, we've internalized the lesson like anyone has. And I think what's even more challenging about this is that because of the nature of social media, we don't even need to be selling in order to feel like we are trying to assign a monetary value to our purpose in this world, which is to say how many Twitter followers you have or how many Instagram followers you have or how many likes you get on any specific post. We still treat metrics as the sign as to whether or not we matter. And I know that this is even more complicated because, for instance, to be able to reach a large audience is what often ensures that we are able to continue doing the work. And again, sometimes that's very specifically in terms of monetary value. How many butts can you get in seats for your event? How many people can you get to buy tickets to an event matters. How many books you sell, how many paintings you sell. That confers meaning and value to the creations that you make, which ensures that you can continue to create them. Right? I know what it feels like to feel like I'm reaching people. And that's not even just about how many books I sell, but the emails that I get from people, the messages that I get from people, the media coverage that I get that says, oh my gosh, like this stuff matters to people. I said something different or in a certain way that people needed to hear. And golly gee, that feels really good. So it doesn't have to be all just selling things. It means having to reach people. It means how many eyeballs are on your thing. How many hearts did you reach? And I certainly know that too. I mean, I do this podcast. I wouldn't do this podcast if no one was listening, right? So I know how important it is to have metrics to measure whether or not our art is making an impact or whether or not our voices matter. But I think that that's what's even more challenging about this moment is that when we only have these social media forums to reach out to each other, we only have the internet as keeping us together. How do we measure things? How do we measure our value as a person? And I think one of the best kinds of commentaries that I've personally seen out of this cultural moment is a lot of people discussing trauma responses and the ways in which we are emotionally reacting to the world right now. And in my experience, just talking to friends and community members, I'm seeing really two different distinct forms. And this is, again, speaking specifically to people who make stuff for a living creatively. I'm seeing people who are responding to this by working extra hard. They might be secretly enthusiastic about having more quote-unquote free time. They might suddenly feel, oh, I can finally get to that project I've been meaning to get to because the day job that I have has shuttered or because all these other things have suddenly become available to me. And I think that that's a really real thing. I think that I'm seeing people very close to me just put their heads down and muscle through. And it could be a distraction technique. It could be a poverty complex technique where, you have to work harder to make sure that you're safe financially and materially in the future. But there are a lot of different reasons in which people are working harder and finding reserves of energy to pour into this moment. And I think that's a very valid, specific path that a lot of people are taking, and I applaud them. And in some ways, I am doing that myself, although I find myself also kind of in the second camp. And that second camp is the people who find it very hard to generate any enthusiasm for anything right now. And I actually, that same friend who used that in phrase, the incentive to create, was talking about sex. And I had actually polled some people on Twitter, the people who follow me on Twitter, as to whether or not they are having more or less sex if they are partnered and quarantining or socially isolating with their partner. And then also if they're masturbating more or less, regardless of relationship status. And I thought it was interesting that I got some very emotional responses in text. It was just a poll, and both polls actually kind of were bizarrely split amongst the more, less, and about the same. Particularly the masturbation poll split almost cleanly into thirds, which I found fascinating. And then also the sex one was similarly kind of just split. It was either more or less or a little bit of not really changing. But the responses, the verbal responses I got to the poll were actually the most telling to me. I saw people saying, I just can't imagine feeling sexual right now. Like there's just nothing about sex that feels even a little bit appealing to me. And then I got responses from people saying, oh my God, I'm like digging through my toy drawer to find things I haven't ever used or haven't used in 15 years. I was so impressed with so many people finding new reserves of energy sexually. And I feel it's very similar with creation. There are a lot of people who find it incredibly hard to get a boner for their work, to be perfectly frank, to want to work on the stuff that they've got. Personally, I've got a lot of work on my plate for day jobby stuff and freelancey stuff. So I find it almost impossible for me to generate any energy besides just kind of trying to remake my current situation so that I can make it reasonable and tenable for me to hold on to. And again, a huge privilege of having a lot of work right now. I don't know how long any of that work will last, so I'm trying to be extra diligent to make sure that I'm tackling all of those projects in a way that feels an integrity for my own work ethic. But at the same time, I have been working on a play that I'm super excited about, and I cannot get the energy to work on it. It's just, I'm finding it just, at the end of a day, the last thing I want to do is mine my own subconscious and my own thoughts for the creation I want to make. And I think this leads me to kind of the third and final point about why I think so many of us are struggling with this incentive to create right now is that we don't know what the future looks like right now. I found myself when I was speaking to my family recently on Zoom saying that I just wanted to be able to skip to the last chapter and just read it so I know what to plan for. And of course, that is absolutely impossible, and nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, and nobody ever really does. But when things are stable, it's much easier to plan. And the fact that everything is so unstable means that we have no ability to plan or future cast right now, or we have a lessened ability, or many of us, I don't want to speak for all of us, have a harder time thinking about the future right now. And when we don't know what the future looks like, it feels very hard to know how to write or to create. And I don't mean just for like what kinds of pilots will Hollywood be optioning in a year. I mean, what does art look like to me personally? What do I actually have to say right now? And I think a lot of us find ourselves stymied by feeling like we're feeling the wrong thing, or we're having the wrong thoughts, or we're just, even when things move this quickly, not even in a year, but in a week, we might have a different opinion, right? And I think I see this when we walk out the doors now. Like, if you went to the grocery store 3 weeks ago, how different does it look when you go yesterday? And that's because society is changing rapidly to try to adapt to very confusing times. And I think that it doesn't surprise me that our creative impetus is moving just as quickly to try and make sense of all of this. Some of us are early adapters, and we're trying really hard to get our TV shows up on Instagram Live and live stream our events and just adapt quickly to this changing environment. But I also think that many of us find just that concept alone to be truly daunting. That thinking 6 months in the future, 6 weeks in the future, 6 days in the future feels untenable. So what will any of this mean? And of course, some people have been getting online and talking about how amusing it's going to be when all of a sudden we have all these quarantine pilots and quarantine plays and quarantine albums and all these things that have been created while people are socially distancing. And I think I wonder, what will any of this mean? What will it matter? And I think ultimately that feels like a very common thing for many artists. I certainly am not alone in that kind of existential considerations of value, of what do I have to say that will provide anything for anyone ever? And that's certainly something I experienced with sex as a sex educator. It's like, what can I possibly teach people that they can't just learn on their own? And I also feel this as an artist. What do I have to say that means anything to anyone? And so I think we creators, we cling to those times that we have said something that meant something to someone. And for me, I got into sex education because I had a bunch of people telling me how good I was at it. And it felt good to feel like I was providing value in people's lives. And so I followed that path until I got to where I am now. And I feel like a lot of us do the same thing with art. We make a thing, and if we get enough people that say, oh my God, that thing is so cool, we follow those breadcrumbs. And hopefully those breadcrumbs are in alignment with what also provides joy for us. Not all of us are so lucky, but I think that's kind of that's the gold standard. That's the ideal artistic career, is making cool things that we love personally, that other people also love, such that we can continue doing the things that we love. Now, of course, this means we're always working always, but I think that's part of the deal. So, of course, the answer is I don't know what the last chapter of this book looks like. I don't know what the implications of all of this are. I think that I have found that what I've been doing, which has been the most useful, has been to give myself permission to stare vacantly out a window for far longer than I ever would before. And I'm trying to be okay sitting and having a cup of tea and just being. Because again, that I think is what this cultural moment is asking us to do, and it goes against every instinct we have as Americans and as capitalists. We feel like we must do to matter. But right now, the most important thing we can do for ourselves and our families and our communities is to do nothing, to go nowhere, to make or undertake nothing new. Just to give ourselves permission to be and exist without considering or prioritizing how much that matters to the state, which is terrifying. And it's particularly terrifying for those people who are materially directly affected by this, which is to say millions and millions of people who feel like not only do they feel like they have to work, but they also really wish that they could, to be able to pay for the rent and to be able to do all the things that we need to do to survive. I would like to encourage all of us, and I, of course, am saying this mostly to myself, but hopefully it's useful to you. I would like to encourage all of us to give ourselves permission to stare at the blank page and do nothing with it. I think that is the first step. I don't know what the next step is, but I think the first step is giving ourselves permission just to be, just to remember that our value as a person isn't about what we make. And I know that's really hard. I think that it might be one of the hardest things I ever have to do in my life, is to give myself permission to not make things and still count, and to still be a vibrant human being. Even saying that I feel like a fraud, but I feel like this is really important for myself as an artist and for myself as a person, to just be okay just being. To sit with myself and not judge myself, to let a deadline pass by without feeling like I'm a bad person and, as I said earlier, out of integrity, to say to people, I can't make that for you right now. I am sorry, but my heart and head are not there right now. That's really hard to do. I did that already twice in the past 2 weeks. And I felt like a bad person, and I felt weak, and I felt useless, and I felt like I was passing up a great opportunity. But I knew myself well enough to say, this isn't where I need to be focusing my time and energy right now. I need to be focusing my time and energy far more inside the four walls in which I physically inhabit right now, and being okay with that. Because, you matter. Whether or not you make shit, whether or not you struggle and fail or just never try, you matter. Your existence as a person counts. Period. I really think that we need to learn to believe that. Because if we believe that for ourselves, that will naturally, hopefully, flow towards believing it for other people too. Believing that extending ourselves in the ways that we can to take care of people who cannot necessarily take care of certain things at certain times is valuable. To care for people, to inject some of our labor into our immediate communities to support one another. We are looking at ideas like mutual aid. The people who have a little bit more are doing a little bit more for their communities who cannot right now. We are reminding ourselves of the value of the other people in our society. It's funny, right now this reminds me so much of the poem Wild Geese by Mary Oliver, a poet that we lost very, very recently. And of course, the poem is so famous, but I think it so speaks to this. Let me just recite part of it now. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. And of course it goes on, and then the last line. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. We do not have to be good. We do not have to walk on our knees repenting. We just have to be. We just have to feel our feelings right now. That's really what this moment is calling upon us to do. And it's hard. It might be one of the hardest things any of us have to do spiritually. But I think it's essential to learn to love each other better, to learn to be better stewards of our world and of each other, and to resist these cultural forces that tell us that we're wrong for just wanting to exist. And I think that I would be very, very happy if, as this situation prolongs and as it ebbs and as it ends, we remember that we are not our labor. Our right to live is not contingent on how much we make, and that ultimately our continued existence is meaning enough. That's it for this week's episode of Artgasm. Thank you for listening. Let me know if this meant anything to you whatsoever. I feel, I'm going to be honest and vulnerable right now, very insecure about sharing stuff like this. I like doing it, but I struggle with my own sense of didacticism and advice giving and sermonizing. So I hope that this is useful to you. If it is, let me know. In the meantime, you can always reach out to me. I'm on Twitter at HeyAllieMoon. That's HeyAllieMoon. You can email me at artgasmcast@gmail.com. If you found this useful and you want to hear more of these, I have a Patreon. Of course, it does help me buy bags of groceries as necessary, and that's a really wonderful thing to do, and I certainly appreciate everyone who supports me on Patreon so much. And you can find more quickie things by going to patreon.com/artgasmcast. And in the meantime, I will be back next week with a full-length interview with another wonderful artist. And until then, thank you so much for listening, and do stay safe, do tend to each other and yourselves to the best of your ability, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.